Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on creating safe online spaces. My name is Agnieszka Kolesińska, and together with my colleagues, Alan, Denise, and Art Kermans, I will be hosting today's event. Okay, so before we move forward with the seminar, I would like to briefly introduce the project that is what brings us here together today. So a Resistira project aims at understanding the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and respective policy responses on behavioral, social, and economic inequalities in 31 countries, the EU 27 and Iceland, Serbia, Turkey, and the UK, and to work towards individual and societal resilience. Resistira does so by mapping policy responses, collecting and analyzing quantitative and qualitative data, and by translating those into insights to be used for designing, devising, and piloting solutions for improved policies and social innovations. The project relies on a 10-partner multidisciplinary European consortium and a well-established network of researchers in 31 countries that I already mentioned before. We built on an intersectional gender plus theoretical framework, and we're focusing on the intersection of specific domains of gender inequalities, such as work and labor market, the economy, the gender pay and pension gap, with selected inequality grounds, sex and or gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, race, and so on. The overall methodology of the project is based on a step-by-step process running in 3 cycles over the period of 30 months. So we started in April 2021, and we will finish in September 2023. All project activities are organized in this 3 cycles, and they are feeding results into one another. During today's webinar, we will focus on some of the results of the current 2nd cycle of the project, which are related to the topic of online gender-based violence. We are going to listen to the presentations of 3 inspiring panelists. It will be Hera Hossain from Chain, Shanley Clement Mclaren from Stop Fisha, and Gabriela de Oliveira from Glitch. I will obviously introduce the panelists in more detail later on, right before their talks. But right now, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Art, who will tell us a little bit more about the objectives of this webinar and about the results coming from the Resistira project.
Thank you, Agnieszka. I'll just briefly share my screen. Okay, you should be able to see this now.
Yes, we do.
Yeah, okay. So I will briefly introduce the specific topic of this webinar, which is creating safe digital spaces. First, I'll go over the problem statement that is in our fact sheet on the topic, and I'll move on to some insights that we have gleaned from the Resistira project, and ultimately conclude with some of the better stories we have identified and have included in the fact sheet as well. But first of all, the problem statement. As I'm sure you all know, the Istanbul Convention is the benchmark for international standards in the field of countering violence against women and domestic violence. But on the EU level, as of yet, there is no specific legal instrument yet that addresses these topics. On the 8th of March of 2022, the European Commission did propose a directive on combating violence against women and domestic violence. And this directive encompasses both offline and online forms of violence, criminalizing the most common forms of gender-based cyber violence, like the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and content, and as well as cyber stalking. Despite this, there is still a general absence of digital gender-based violence from the public debate around violence. And this might be in part due to the lack of a shared definition of digital gender-based violence. So how can we address the issue if there is no agreed upon definition? As of yet, it remains invisible, so to speak. Some insights that we have gathered in the Digital project. First and foremost, the risk of experiencing digital violence increased substantially during the pandemic for all users with for all people with a virtual presence. And this was due to the increased usage of digital technologies, and especially during periods of national lockdowns. And despite this, digital violence does not feature in any of the national recovery and resilience plans that were compiled by the EU member states in the wake of the pandemic to recover from the effects of COVID-19. And generally, there's just a lack of mechanisms to prevent digital violence and to support safety online, both on national levels and on the EU level. What we have also found is that there is a need to update the Istanbul Convention. At this point, it's over 10 years old, and it should be updated to reflect this increase, this rising trend in digital violence. Moreover, there is a general lack of accountability for tech companies and social media platforms, with little real consequences for what is essentially facilitating widespread online abuse and harassment. And this is especially the case for people with a significant public presence, with a big online presence, especially for women and people of color. They are often targeted with abusive invective, their personal data can be leaked, and they are often subjected to threats against their personal safety and well-being. And this, of course, has profound consequences for their mental and physical health, and can intimidate them into being silenced on the topics that they care about. Moreover, new digital technologies also bring a host of issues with them. They are often designed without including the perspectives of women and of survivors of gender-based violence. And this means that new forms of gender-based violence and digital gender-based violence can pop up. For example, the weaponization of smart homes, where a person's house, for instance, is targeted by someone, and they increase the temperature or increase volume levels inside the house. And new digital technologies can also facilitate existing forms of gender-based violence. When stalkers, for instance, use tracking devices or tracking apps to more effectively stalk their victims. Last but not least, digital violence is also often overlooked in employers' anti-harassment policies, which is doubly important now because of the increased use of telework and working from home arrangements. So this is also another avenue that we've seen. It's not all doom and gloom, however. We've seen some better stories in our research as well. And better stories are a concept that we borrow from scholar Dina Georges. And it signifies promising and inspiring practices like policies or civil society initiatives that are not a perfect fix, but illustrates how a given societal situation can be improved. So it's not an unattainable, perfect solution, but rather something that can inspire similar stories like it. The first of the better stories we identified was Maruti Chatbot, which is an internet freedom and safety tool, which teaches people about digital harassment, how to report it, how to protect yourself against it, and how to support others who have been affected by it. And this tool was developed by Plan International and the Feminist Internet Collective. It was co-designed with young activists according to feminist design principles, meaning that it was that it ensured inclusive and empathetic language, that it maintained a global perspective, and that it maintained a global perspective without while looking at the barriers to entry that a tool like this might impose on people. Then we identified two initiatives by the United Nations Population Fund. They were both part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence event organized by the Center for Women's Global Leaderships. And the first of these initiatives is called Body Right, which highlights that corporate images and intellectual property are often better protected on the internet than images of human bodies are, in terms of what people can do with them on the internet and how they are shared. And the other initiative by the UNFPA was the Virtual Israel, a website featuring stories of digital violence survivors and the ways in which the Population Fund tries to address these kinds of stories. Thirdly, we identified Digital Safety, which is an online interactive fiction game presenting stories of digital violence. It covers educational scenarios of 3 young African women dealing with digital violence, and it reaches tools and guidance to people for dealing or for protecting themselves better online. And this was developed by the East African Feminist Collective Policy. And lastly, the CyberSafe project, an EU-funded project which developed a toolkit on digital sexual violence. So this toolkit includes tools that can be used in workshops on this same topic. And the project itself also promotes responsible online behavior among young people. And with that, I've briefly gone over our fact sheet, and I give the floor back to you, Agnieszka.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this for giving us this background of our research findings. Right now, we will move to the main part of today's webinar, and we will listen to the presentations of our invited speakers, our panelists. We might have time to ask one follow-up question after each of the presentations. But we will also have specifically designated time for discussion after the panel. So do not worry if you run a little bit over time. So as the first one, I would like to present Hera Hussain, who is the founder and the CEO of Chain, a global non-profit organization that creates resources on the web to address gender-based violence. Chain's multilingual resources designed with, not for survivors, have reached more than 500,000 people. Hera was raised in Pakistan and living in the UK, and she knew from early on that she wanted to tackle violence against women. She believes in using the power of open source technology, trauma-informed design, and hope-filled framing to solve the world's pressing issues. She was one of the Forbes 30 under 30 and MIT Technology Review's Innovators under 35 list. And now I will give the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Agnieszka. That was a great introduction. Great to talk to all of you. You may hear from my voice that I am very sick, so apologies about sounding like this. Today I actually feel a lot better, but until yesterday I could barely speak. So I'm going to talk to you about, tell you a little bit about Chen and also about the kind of work that we did during the pandemic to tackle digital violence and also just the nature of gender-based violence and identifying the gaps. I'm going to share my screen and talk you through this. So here we go. So I founded Gent in 2013. And I founded it because I was helping two friends very close to me get out of abusive marriages. One of them was in the UK. She's from Pakistan, and the other one was in Pakistan. And I just found it really hard to help them because I couldn't find information online. This is like really the early days, like 9 years ago. Charities weren't used to having very like full websites, and all the information was very sort of like monocultural. There wasn't stuff. Most of the stuff that I found was in English, and it just wasn't very diverse. Often quite stereotyped entire different cultures, and came across sometimes as quite racist as well. So I really wanted to do something about that, and this idea that actually the offline world and the online world are separate just did not make sense to me as a young person for whom like the boundaries were very intermeshed. So that I just saw life as online and offline, and the friend I was trying to help did not want to go to a charity in person, did not want to pick up the phone. And she kept saying, like, why can't I just chat to someone online? Why can't we just find all this stuff online? Why do we have to speak to people? Because she couldn't get herself to express what was happening to her in words and didn't feel comfortable talking about it. So that's really the birth of Jen. That's how Jen started, because I wanted to create that space online. And I had been in the various tech spaces. So what Jen does now is it has resources on a number of topics, which you can see here, that are all created by survivors from different countries, different languages, culture, experiences. And then we have experts in our community check them. And those resources, are all the way from like, how do I stay safe online, to, how do I collect evidence of domestic abuse, to how do I recover from sexual trauma. So if you go here, you can see the kind of services that we have and find out more about the organization. Now, I've been doing this work of looking at tech-enabled gender-based violence from day one. That was one of the first organizations in the world to look at this. And it's because we kept coming across that, and there was so many resources online about experiences of women journalists and politicians, but there was nothing for everyday women. So I really wanted to work on that. And that's kind of like what got me started and Chan started on this journey to look at tech-enabled abuse. So during the pandemic, actually, we did something. We created a new service called Bloom. So for many policymakers, many people in the charity sector, social services, this idea that you also need to have things online was so new, and the pandemic was just like, boom, wow, yes, we can't have everything reliant on going to places in person. Obviously, this is what I've been talking about since day one of starting Jen, and people thought I was just a young person who just loved tech so much and did not really understand that's not how it works. So the pandemic really brought that for people, because you couldn't go out, you couldn't go to any in-person support groups. Helplines were being overrun, and really, if you can't it just, I think it helped people understand that when we think about gender-based violence and domestic violence and sexual violence, we often imagine, if it's a spectrum, we often imagine people at the end of the spectrum of intensity of where someone's life at risk. So we think, actually, if someone's life at risk, all that someone needs is the police, all someone needs is to get out of the house. But it's a continuum. People, stay in abusive situations for weeks, months, years, and Chen is designed to help those people, all those people who need time to figure out what to do. So Bloom actually emerged as a very quick thing, and I'm going to tell, this is a really good example of some quick innovation if you're set up for it. Given that all of our work is digital, all of our stuff is digital, so we were going to do that. But we wanted to create an online space where people can get one-to-one support, but also get self-help content around recovery, really in-depth content, the kind of content that they would get if they were in person, sitting in a support group. And this inspiration came from the support groups that of amazing rape crisis centers around the world run around recovery. So I had an idea on a Saturday, which I pitched to our volunteers, because we have a hybrid organization. We have volunteers and staff. So we have a call every Sunday, and I pitched it to the team on a Sunday saying, I want to create this online program. Do you think it's a good idea? Do you want to do it? And they were like, yes. So we came up with this idea of creating a course called Recovering from Trauma and Trauma Resilience. And it was supposed to be a 10-week course. We did not have the content, and we announced it on a Tuesday. We had 100 signups, and then we had to write the content live as we delivered it. So that's kind of like the beginning of it. But I'll tell you how it works now. It's now, this is not 2 years later, 2.5 years later. We have funding for this work. We have worked a lot on it. So this is Bloom, and what it does is that we have courses, which I'll show you in a second. And they are videos that have captions and transcripts, and they're very in-depth courses. Each course can be about 20,000 to 50,000 words, if that gives you an idea of the kind of depth we're talking about. And here you can see some of the courses. They're available in 4 languages right now. In English, French, Spanish, Hindi, and Portuguese is coming soon. And these courses, so people can take them in their own time. By the same time, they can chat to our team one-to-one about what their reflections are on these courses. Someone might take this course on, for example, recovering from toxic and abusive relationships, and attend like the session, which is about, boundary setting, or like what are the like misogyny, how does misogyny come into a relationship, and then reflect on how they've experienced it, and then chat to our team. And unlike what most helplines do, where they're not allowed to really share, like people on the other side of the helpline staff are not allowed to usually share anything about their lives, our service runs the exact opposite way. Our staff share that they're survivors. 70% of our team are survivors. They share their experiences. So it's a form of peer support and reflection. So that's kind of the service we run. 97% of people who've taken part in our service will recommend it to another survivor. So we have really, really high satisfaction from it. And in my last few minutes, I just want to talk to you about with something like this, how do you develop something like this? One of the interesting things about this service is, because we cannot do due diligence on anyone who's attending this, because we have signups from area. We've had more than 1,500 people take part in this. We don't allow any survivor to survivor interaction, which is actually one of the most powerful things you can do, is allow survivors to support each other. But because we cannot guarantee safety, we've designed it in a way that they just talk to Chen, they don't talk to each other. And these comes from our principles. We have trauma-informed design principles, which are these, and we think about these factors when we design our services, because we strongly believe that if we create better tech, if we create better spaces, if we center things like safety, equity, hope, power sharing, agency, all of these things into the way we design services and online spaces and tech products, then we're going to reduce the harm that can happen in the first place. We've actually done a lot of research on this during pandemic as well. We produced a 120-page guide called Orbits, which I'll share the link on later. And this goes into, there are lots of different things here that would be useful for any researchers. We talk about how to do research on gender-based violence with these trauma-informed design principles. So the same principles that I've discussed here, we look at the view of policy, tech design, and research for tech-enabled gender-based violence. We have a new course hopefully coming up in the next few months, which is going to look specifically for Bloom, looking at image-based abuse and looking at things like shame and dignity and resilience. So there's a lot of content that is going to be coming up around tech-enabled abuse. So what I wanted to leave you with is that all the stuff that Jen has done in the pandemic, the main thing I'd say is that the lines between online and offline are not as clear for younger people that are growing up. Those worlds are just enmeshed. What is really clear is, though, that harm can propagate online really quickly. But in the way that Chen runs and thinks about the web, we center joy and hope in our work, because the reason we want a safer web is because so that women and other marginalized genders and can be themselves, can do all the kind of things that other people can do. So often when we talk about harm, we end up focusing so much on harm reduction that we forget that what we're trying to do is create a space that everybody can enjoy, watch clips on YouTube, catch up with friends that build businesses, just being yourself and not facing the external scrutiny that you face if you're a Black woman, if you are a trans survivor, all those things. So just that would be my parting thought, is that just to really center the idea of hope and what we're trying to build, rather than just think about all the ways in which everything is broken right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this amazing talk and for all the inspiring activities that you're carrying, and for really putting the survivors in the center of your design and your services. I think that we will right now let your voice rest a little bit, and we will wait with the questions for the general discussion. And right now we will move to our next speaker, which will be Clement Mclaren, who has been a feminist activist since very young age. She's a co-founder and co-president of the NGO called Stop Fisher, which fights against cybersexism and sexist and sexual cyber violence in France and across borders. And it was during the quarantine, so in April 2020, that Shinley has witnessed the surge of image-based sexual abuse on social media, and therefore launched an alert in reaction to the passivity of moderation. And as a consequence, the organization Stop Fisher was created, and many people from all parts of France joined the fight, such as lawyers, students, parents, and so on. The main work of the association Stop Fisher, it is concentrated on actively reporting accounts, abusive accounts, on prevention and raising awareness, supporting victims with the help of psychiatrists and lawyers, and lobbying for effective policies. And now I would give the floor to Shanley.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me well, first of all?
Yes, perfectly.
Great. Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation and everything. It's super interesting. And by the way, we were a little bit in contact with Shine. Is that how you say it, Shine? Yeah, the Belgian part of it. So it's really a pleasure to be here. Okay, so my name is Shanley, and yeah, I'm the co-founder and co-president of the NGO named Stop Fisher. And so we're like 2 years old, 2.5 years old, because everything began during the first worldwide pandemic, so in April 2020. And so to tell you the truth, it's something which actually fell from the sky. I think it's kind of a French saying, but anyways, because it was really unexpected. And basically what happened is that during the first days of this pandemic, so we were all on our phones, our screens, computers, everything was getting digitalized. And one day I was in my bed on Snapchat, Instagram, and I was just scrolling, and then I see a Snapchat story of my sister, who was literally in the other room. And so I open it and I see she's making a video of herself, and she says, yeah, guys, we cannot go with this situation any longer. Girls, you have to be really careful when you send nudes of yourself to men. And she was saying, and by the way, men who create these Fisher accounts, you guys are just ashamed, it's shameful. And she was just saying, yeah, be careful, guys. And yeah, we'll just hope that everything will be over soon. And I was like watching this in my bed. It was like 1 o'clock in the morning. I was like, what the hell is she talking about? And so I went in her bedroom and I said, girl, you gotta tell me what's going on. What the hell you're talking about? And so at that moment, she explained me that there were 2 accounts on Snapchat created with the name Fisher, with the name of the city, and another one named Affiche les putes, which means to display, to publicly shame les putes de slots with the name of the region. And so she showed me these two accounts, their stories, and I was really shocked with what I saw, because there were plenty of intimate pictures displayed of very young girls with their personal data, such as their name, their social media accounts, also their age, where they live, the phone number of their parents, of themselves, every personal detail, actually. And so there were tons of them, like there were maybe 15 of them per account. And when I saw that, I was so shocked. I tried all night to report them, asked my friends to report these accounts, but Snapchat wasn't reacting. And so the next day I actually discovered the existence of some NGOs existing in France. And so I've sent them the links and everything, and kept contact with them in order for them to shut down these accounts. And so I reported these accounts, and then they got closed. So I was really relieved. But then just a few hours later, I just saw many of her accounts. My sister showed me many of her accounts. And from that moment, it was like a dominoes effect. You click on one account, and then it links you to another one, and then another one, and it's just a never-ending circle. And some of them were in competition. Who's going to put more shocking content, and others were like supporting each other, like we're brothers, we're supporting, and we're going to draw shame on these lots. So it was very, very violent, very aggressive, very dangerous. And so at that moment, I was reporting, but there were so many of these accounts. And once again, they were per city, per school. And it was so dangerous that I was reporting, but nothing was going on anymore. And so these accounts were still existing despite the reporting. And at that moment, I launched an alert on Twitter with the hashtag #StopFisha, because there was a hashtag Fisha going on Twitter saying, oh yeah, the Fisha accounts, the girls are so disgusting, etc. with the hashtag Fisha, and the hashtag #StopFisha was a kind of counter attack to it. And so I did a big thread where I actually put all the resources and everything I knew, how to report, how to make a complaint at the police station, etc., etc. And then I got joined by a lawyer, and then from many, many victims. And at that moment, we created a kind of group to support each other. And there were also people who were willing to help. And it was and this quickly became a kind of watch group, and which was really, really important, because these accounts, even though they started on Snapchat, they actually started going on Twitter, Instagram, and more specifically on Telegram, which is a no-law zone, and where the communities of these Fisha accounts would grow up to 200,000 people. And yeah, so we were basically doing a 24 hours watch group, always somebody who was up at 4 o'clock in the morning or 2 p.m. And at one moment, we were so desperate that we just started massively reporting these accounts. And one day we were like 300 people, 400 people to report one account, which held 240,000 people following that Fisha account. And yeah, it closed to just a few hours later. So that was like a big, powerful victory for us. But yeah, there were so many others afterwards. But anyways, and so we then became a collective called the Salsa Collective, created an Instagram account. And later on, a few months later, we became an NGO, officially, French NGO, named #StopFisha. And today we mainly report these accounts. We still have this watch group where we watch these accounts and try to report them. We also help the victims. So we have psychologists and a lawyer that can accompany these victims. And yeah, we also do some lobbying. And yeah, this is basically our story, I guess. I've said it all. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much for this talk, and thank you for bringing this important issue into life, because I think we are all aware of what was happening during this period of lockdowns, during the period of pandemic in the online space. Just one quick question before we move to the last presentation, because I know that your organization, even though it's so young, as you mentioned, it's been only 2 years, it's been growing pretty fast. So the individuals that are joining your NGO, were they already active in the field of online abuse, hate speech, before the pandemic? Were they interested in it? Or is it like in your case that what was happening during this very specific period sort of motivate them to start the fight?
Well, to tell you the truth, I was like, we were maybe just a few people called themselves feminists, but before that, I mean, the people who joined us were victims, so very young girls, teenagers, or also parents, and so they weren't really into activism or into online hate at all. It's just something that fell on us basically, and so it's just little by little that we learned how social media functions, how algorithms function, moderation, etc. And we basically just learned everything in this emergency. We had no other choice. But before that, yeah, most of us didn't really have an eye on online hate. And even myself, I mean, even though I'm into activism since many years, since I'm 17 years old, I've never really understood the importance of cybersexism and how it can impact our daily life and how dangerous it can be. And I've only realized this when I went through this Stop Pisha battle during the pandemic, and I'm still learning actually today, and the same goes for the others. But it was pretty clear for me since the beginning that this was a feminist issue. And even though other people didn't really see the feminism in it, I'd say, well, little by little, we talked all together. We said, yeah, this is a feminist issue. This is gender-based violence, and more specifically, gender-based violence. And yeah, we kind of built ourselves little by little. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think this is an amazing example of the better stories that Art was mentioning before, and an example of how strong we can be if we join our forces and make this collective effort to fight against online gender-based violence. Thank you very much. And now moving to the last speaker of today's webinar, Gabriela de Oliveira. She's the head of policy, research and campaigns at Glitch. Gabriela's work focuses on preventing online gender-based violence with a focus on experiences of Black women and other marginalized groups. She has a keen interest in participatory approaches to policy, design and research work, given the power of these approaches to put equity and ethics at the heart of her work. The current EU policy around cyber violence and AI are key to Gabriela's role, as well as working on current legislation on the online self-tip bill in the UK. Gabriela has almost a decade experience working in the non-profit sector and speaks English, French, Portuguese, and some Spanish, meaning she's always looking to collaborate across borders where possible. I will give the floor to you, Gabriela.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for inviting me to come and speak today. So I've got some slides. I'll see if I can share my screen. Let me know if you can see that.
Yes, we can.
Great, fantastic. So I'm here talking on behalf of Glitch today. Glitch is a charity committed to ending online gender-based violence. We're not a frontline service. We are survivor-led, but we don't work directly to support survivors when they come forward with their needs. I will talk through the different types of work that we do, but as the introduction very clearly said, my work focuses on advocacy work, and what I decided to share with you today focuses on a piece of research that we did right at the beginning of the pandemic. looking at, in the first few months of the first lockdown in the UK, what the impact of the pandemic was on gender-based abuse. So talking through Glitch and our work, we have 4 kind of parts of our work: awareness, action, advocacy, and anchor. Our awareness work is about changing the public conversation, raising awareness, helping survivors, people affected by online gender-based violence, to have the language to talk about it and have forums to be able to share their experiences or learn from others. Action is about giving people the tools to be able to protect themselves better online and to know what to do if they experience online abuse, but also if they witness it. So we have a whole strand of work within our action work, which is about being an active online bystander and talking to our community about how you can support others if you witness online abuse, which we think is a really important part of the issue. And that action element also brings in skills and education around tech accountability. And we see that as a really important part of what we can do in this space, is kind of mobilize our community to understand better how to hold tech to account and how to ask for the change they want to see. That links through to our advocacy work, which is where I focus most of my efforts. And as the introduction talked about, I'm focused on EU policy, but also we do a lot on the UK online safety bill. And we work also directly with tech companies. So we're on trust and safety councils of TikTok and Twitter. And we obviously are always working to act as what we call a critical friend, being part of those trust and safety councils to really hold up a mirror and show them where their policies aren't being properly upheld. And then finally, Anchor is about the way that we work as a charity. So we try to do charity differently. We work in a way that is trauma-informed. We are a Black-led charity and therefore all of our work is intersectional. We focus on intersectionality in terms of where it came from Kimberly Crenshaw's work in the United States, looking at how actually focusing on Black women's experiences allows you to understand how the forces of patriarchy and white supremacy overlap and how you can better create equity for all by kind of breaking down those power structures. So the research that we did, the report's called The Ripple Effect, COVID-19 and the Epidemic of Online Abuse. I can link it to you. We published it in September 2020, and the piece of research took part in those first few months of the pandemic. So I'll just share some findings here, and do stop me if I'm going over time. There we go. So just to give actually a bit of background on the piece of research itself, we did a survey. We spoke to survivors of online abuse. We were trying to understand, while we were in that first lockdown, what is the impact of the pandemic? And a lot of the findings that we had actually echo what we've heard today. So hopefully we can see some kind of read across from the findings of the Resistere report. So what did we find? We found that many experienced abuse in the first few months of the pandemic. And as we've already heard today, that increased and worsened during the pandemic. And important to note that those figures increased when talking about Black and minoritized women and non-binary people. So both in terms of having experienced abuse and the increase in abuse that was worse for Black and minoritized women and non-binary people. Most of the abuse took place on mainstream social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, but there was also abuse that took place on platforms like Zoom and Slack that are used for employment, which was an important theme that came out and something that was reflected in today's report as well. The majority of abuse was from strangers, 84%. And there's been a huge amount of conversation in the UK around anonymity, but actually we didn't get into the kind of anonymity debate. And what we found is, having done work after this, that a lot of those strangers do have their names, their photos, their personal details on their account. So it's not necessarily about anonymity, but the fact that the online space does open you up to abuse from strangers, from people that aren't known to you. At the same time, abuse also came from acquaintances, partners, ex-partners, and colleagues. So 16% of respondents faced abuse from acquaintances, 10% from a partner or an ex-partner, and 9% from a colleague or superior at work, which then you start to see, you know, as Hera was talking about, there's no kind of division between the online and the offline. If you're experiencing abuse, whether it's at work, in your social life, your personal life, in your romantic life, that can happen online and offline, and it was having the same kind of impacts on those who took part in the research. What we found was that gender was the most cited reason for online abuse. So 48% of respondents reported suffering from gender-based abuse specifically, and that abuse was intersectional. So just to explain that, that meant that depending on the person's identities and the kind of position that they held, that actually they would suffer different types of abuse and were likely to suffer abuse. So for example, 21% of respondents reported abuse related to their gender identity and sexual orientation. And that's why it's really important to Glitch that we talk about gender-based abuse as something that affects all minority genders and not just violence against women and girls. 18% of respondents received abuse for their ethnic background, and we know that racism is a really severe issue in the online space. 10% for their religion and 7% for their disability. So, and then you start to see, depending on the different identities that people hold and live through, that actually that puts them at risk of different forms of abuse. And it's really important in our research to really try to understand that and unpack that, so that we're not missing the intersections of how this abuse manifests in the online space. Abuse impacts people's behaviors. It's not that surprising, but we really saw that 77% of respondents who received abuse reported modifying their behavior as a result of it. So what we started to see was people using social media differently, and that might be posting less, that might be deleting their accounts, changing what they share online. And that was really worrying to see such high figures, particularly when looking at Black and minoritized women and non-binary people, which increased up to 87%. So really important to think about what kind of impact that's having on the conversation and the participation that we're seeing on online spaces. The majority of those who reported said the complaint was not properly addressed, and this reflects a lot on Stockfisher's work as well. And that proportion again increased for Black and minoritized women. So 94% of Black and minoritized women and non-binary people said that when they reported it, their complaint wasn't properly addressed, and therefore there's a lack of understanding. And we know this from having worked directly with a lot of tech companies. There's a real lack of understanding of that intersectional abuse, of how women of color are experiencing not only gender-based violence, but also violence related to their ethnic identity, and that means that the way that abuse manifests is different. And we've been working to try and influence not only tech companies, but government in terms of making sure that reporting structures are improved, prevention is improved. And I'll get onto these recommendations in a minute, but specifically that policies apply to Black and minoritized women, so that this kind of form of abuse can be properly responded to. So in terms of our recommendations, I will whisk through these. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time because I can't see my watch, but yes.
You still have 4 minutes.
Okay, great. So just to say, we had recommendations which you can obviously read more about in the report. So we have recommendations for employers, government, tech companies, and civil society. And a lot of these, again, kind of reflect the work that we've heard today. So I'll just pick out a few important ones. With employers, what we really want is for employers to engage. What we were hearing about is people reporting this to employers, asking for support. And often, what we've talked about in terms of those who have a public role that is related to their work are more at risk. We work a lot with politicians, journalists, activists, sports people, celebrities, and yet their employers don't have policies and structures to support them when they're experiencing online abuse. They don't have any policies to help prevent that. It's only ever this kind of reactive approach, often sometimes not even providing that sort of support. In terms of government, we've done a lot of work with government in the last 5 years, and obviously a lot in the UK based on the Online Safety Bill. But I think the recommendation I want to bring out is the number 2 here, about the comprehensive public health approach to online abuse. And this is because I think Glitch differs from some other organisations on this, where we understand that criminal justice is very important to a lot of victim survivors. However, we don't feel like, particularly in the UK, but also in the EU, that we're seeing via the directive, that focusing entirely on a criminalizing approach is the right approach to online gender-based violence. This isn't an issue that needs proper education, it needs public awareness. We need to teach people what online abuse is, what it looks like. There is research that shows, perpetrators of online abuse not understanding that what they're taking part in is abuse, and victim survivors not understanding that what they're experiencing is abuse. So we have this huge education gap, and yet we are moving forward at a much faster rate with the criminalization of different types of online abuse and gender-based violence, without supporting the work that will actually prevent the harm from happening in the first place. So we're really keen for the government to actually invest in education approaches and invest in public health awareness campaigns and approaches that will help all parts of society understand they have a role to play here in reducing the level of abuse that women and non-binary people experience online. For tech companies, there's a lot here, but it's mostly about being transparent. And that means around content moderation, around their policies, what exists, what doesn't, and around their algorithms and the impact of that algorithm. And we've been seeing more and more whistleblowers coming out during the pandemic and seeing the urgency of these issues. And what we really want to see is more transparency, more accountability, and a focus on prevention. So yes, reporting needs to improve. But when tech companies only focus on reporting, again, there is not the work that's happening to ensure that platform design and algorithms, which is contributing to the level of abuse and the nature of abuse that's taking part on platforms, to change. So that's something that we're always talking about and really trying to get tech companies to engage on. And then on civil society, as we always talk about, more collaboration. I think at least across the EU and in the UK, there is a lot of collaboration, and today is a great example of that. But sharing our experiences, learning from each other, but also a real call to action here for civil society to focus on collecting data on specific risks for minoritized communities. Without that data, without that focus, we cannot understand some of the more complex dynamics that are happening in this space. There is a real risk of us having research that just doesn't reflect the experience of these communities, and therefore isn't really addressing the need that there is. I'll stop there. I'm sure I'm out of time, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your presentation was perfectly within the time limits. Thank you very much for your talk and for all this amazing work, for collecting this incredibly important and informative data. I wanted to refer to the last thing you said, so the need of actually monitoring what is happening and collecting reliable intersectional data, because that's the only way I think that we can actually make the society realize how big and important the problem is. We will definitely go back to the discussion of on accountability of tech companies and also the online safety bill later on during this webinar in the general discussion. But right now I will maybe give the floor to Art again so that he can present our recommendations right now in response to the ones that you've just shared. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Okay, so the Resistere project has a set of 6 recommendations, and this will reiterate a lot of what you've already heard talked about. But first of all, our recommendation is to counter digital violence through education, so addressing the general cultural ignorance of digital gender-based violence. Digital gender-based violence is often missing in current school curricula, and if it is there, it is lacking a very important gender perspective. So our recommendation would be to implement modules on digital gender-based violence in education from a given age onwards. And it would make sense, in our opinion, that this is a European-wide system, as this is an issue that transcends national borders. Secondly, addressing digital violence in policies. So first of all, adopting a common definition of digital violence is crucial, and then subsequently utilizing it consistently in policies. Institutional policies and mechanisms to prevent and protect against digital violence are essential, as well as dedicated support structures for survivors. And it's important that these use an anticipatory approach, meaning that regulations can adjust quickly to changing conditions on the grounds or to new emerging technologies. We also advocate for a more adequate response from law enforcement to incidences of digital violence. And we think it's crucial that new policies and institutional regulations are co-designed with survivors so that their perspectives and insights are included. Third, we advocate for the adoption of the European Commission Directive by the European Parliament and the Council. This would obviously have positive effects towards countering gender-based violence in general, so not just the digital aspect of it, and the explicit references to digital forms of abuse and violence in the directive could also signal the beginning of more targeted policies around this kind of harassment. Fourth, we recommend to hold tech companies and social media platforms accountable. They have an obligation to protect the users of their platforms and products and to monitor for incidents of violence. So this means providing improved mechanisms and tools to their users, for instance, giving them more control over their privacy settings or giving them more options for reporting, ensuring that their data and messages are encrypted. And social media platforms can also be used in turn to foster empowerment and activism against digital violence. For instance, by social media companies facilitating or even organizing public campaigns against digital violence. And in this regard, it's also important that social media companies and tech companies collaborate and exchange information on how to best deal with these issues. Then designing trauma-informed digital technologies, meaning that survivors of violence and digital violence are involved in the creation of new technologies, which will allow the creators of those technologies to identify crucial flaws and factors that could jeopardize women's safety. And crucial here is, of course, that there is transparency across the board about the further development of those technologies, so that there aren't any surprises in the future. And then lastly, we recommend to include digital violence in employers' anti-harassment policies, which would broaden their scope and which would be a welcome update to their equality and diversity policies. So this these were the 6 recommendations from Resistire. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I would like you to share your thoughts, your reflections on the presented recommendations. Therefore, we will move to the first part of our roundtable discussion. I will ask for help my colleague Alan, who will be moderating this session, and we would like to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the presented work? Alan?
Yes, thank you, Agnieszka, and thank you all the speakers for these inspiring stories and experiences. And maybe to get started with, of course, everybody can raise their hand or put a question in the chat. But to follow up on what Agnieszka just said, I would like to ask the speakers maybe for the spontaneous reactions to the recommendations that are just presented. So this is, of course, always a choice that we made as researchers in deciding on where to put the emphasis in terms of recommendations we were making to different types of stakeholders, not only policymakers, but different types of stakeholders, and to ask you, how does this resonate with you? What is striking you? What do you consider to be the most important of these recommendations on the basis of your own personal experience, of the experience of your organization? And maybe follow the logics of the on the sequence of your presentation. So starting with Hera, if you have some reactions.
Yes, thank you so much. I think that the recommendations are really interesting, and the three that really struck me is one is like the need to specifically name the digital violence, and even though all gender-based violence, when we talk about gender-based violence, it should encompass both online and offline aspects of it. The problem is when you start to implement those. Often things like police, lawyers, services don't recognize that unless it's specifically named. So naming is a very powerful tool. So I think that part's really important. I also think the specifically addressing that there's a gendered and racial impact to this is also quite important, because like the great work that Glitch does has shown, Black women, for example, are I think it's 83 times, Gabriella, is 83 times more likely, 84 times more likely to receive abuse on Twitter. So these are the kind of things that we want to specifically mention that, so people can understand that there's because the understanding in the EU around the issues of intersectionality is really varied. So I think that's something that we should very clearly name as something that makes you more vulnerable. And number three, I think in terms of the responsibilities of tech companies, I think this is where I would probably ask for more nuance, because I think that, like I was saying in my remarks earlier, there's a lot of responsibility that tech companies should take and should be accountable for: timely response, better design features, more variation of bans and limitations of rights on those who do this, proactive filtering. All this, just so much that can be done. However, I think that if we in terms of just the future of tech, it's important that we understand that it's in our benefit to have a free and enabling environment for people from different spaces to express themselves. So, definitely no to abuse, but we cannot let this kind of issue be used and weaponized by people who don't want to see free speech online. And I think there's just a lot of work around anonymity and privacy that needs to be we need to hold space for that. Often that authoritarian governments will use violence against women and children as a way of clamping down on the kind of free speech that then results in journalists and activists not to being able to do the work that they do and speak for human rights. So I think that there's just a balance that we need to strike there. That would be my recommendation on that particular point to be able to do that.
Thank you, Hera. And the things you say, I'm sure, will trigger reactions, so that works quite well. But I pass first to Shanley, if you want to give your own takeaways on the basis of our recommendations.
Yeah, I actually agree with Hera with what she said. So I'd like to, what I found interesting is the fact to actually define cyber violence, gender-based violence, cyber violence, and give a clear definition, because what I've noticed is that today most people talk about cyber harassment to actually include all types of cyber violences, and it's not very appropriate, and there's a real difficulty to actually name the cyber violence, and it's actually by naming it then you can recognize it and give proper solutions to each type of different cyber violences. And that's why I find it interesting and important to give definitions to gender-based cyber violence, but also to all the different types of cyber violences, which how can I say this, which is linked to it, as for example, so we mostly focus on image-based sexual abuse, and what unfortunately, what we've noticed is that most people talk about revenge porn. However, it's extremely inappropriate, and yeah, it's like revenge. It's as if the victim was, how can I say this? She's responsible for what the victim has been going through. And porn, well, not all the intimate pictures of porn, and not victims do not want their content to be labeled as being porn. So I feel like clearly defining the terms and cyber violence is important in this sense. And what I've also noticed is, so it's still linked to this thing of naming, is that 10 companies, when we report cyber violences, there's like weird categories. For example, on Snapchat, when I wanted to report image-based sexual abuse on Snapchat, or cyber harassment on Snapchat, it was basically malicious behavior. However, this can mean literally everything. And when you're a victim of cyber violence, well, is this malicious behavior or is it something else? And most of the times, victims have been telling us that they don't know in which category to actually report. And we also have this issue, but this is more of a French scale issue, is that our main reporting, how can I say, website does not really include cyber violence, and most of the time victims cannot report because it's too blurry. So naming things is so important, and I think that's great. What else? What I wanted to say? Yes, so there's heaps of stuff on social media in Resistire's propositions, but I was thinking, how can we handle social media such as Telegram, for example? This is, I think, going to be a real challenge. And for me, there's like social media on one side and Telegram on the other, because Telegram does not really cooperate. So how do you guys see Telegram? That was my question. Yeah, and I think that's all.
Thank you, Shanli. And Gabriela?
Yeah, I guess to lead on from a lot of that, you know, the importance of naming things, I completely agree. We recently did a piece of research that was kind of social listening, you know, in the last kind of 6 months. And what we were looking at is the language that Glitch uses and the language that our community uses and the people affected by this issue use. And we absolutely saw what Shani just said in terms of the language being most common around grooming, cyber harassment and cyberbullying when talking about all forms of online gender-based violence and online abuse. So what we took away from that, and I think something important to talk about in these spaces as well, is sometimes as policy people or kind of research people, we do love to define things, and it is absolutely crucial, don't get me wrong, but we do love to define things, and we can have these really interesting and deep conversations in spaces like this. And then we take things out to the world like image-based sexual abuse, and it takes a very long time to close that gap between language like revenge porn and image-based sexual abuse. So I think there's a piece there around, yes, definitions, but how do we also reflect language that is being currently used, language that people understand, that people can relate to, and take people on a journey towards or away from language that is often victim blaming, it's often based in sexism, misogyny and racism, and how do we shift that across into more trauma-informed language, I think is really interesting. And that links to the other recommendations around being trauma-informed, which is absolutely crucial. And you can hear by the way that Hira and Shani do their work of how important it is if you're survivor-led, if you're working with victims and survivors, like that work is entirely different, and being trauma-informed is something that you live and breathe. It's not an add-on, it's not something you think about afterwards. And really thinking about how we're doing this work, I think is a really important recommendation, and something that in a way can be sidelined a little bit when you're talking to tech companies or government, because you think, okay, I need to, you know, make this briefing and I need to make this very clear point on why this is important, and you kind of lose that understanding that we are talking about trauma, we are talking about harm, and we need to be able to put survivors at the center without disempowering them. So how do people feel able to share their experiences, advocate for the change they want to see, without being forced to, for example, share their experiences. So we have this a lot at Glitch. Many of us are survivors, but we don't share our personal stories because it's not something that we feel like we need to do to be able to be valid in taking part in debates and in this space. So really understanding where that's appropriate, where that's not, and the value of kind of working with survivors, but not necessarily just for their stories.
Thank you. And again, you're referring to what Hera explained us about the design principles that Shane is following, which in a way would be a good practice to, or an inspiring practice, or practice to inspire others to make this concrete and to transform this emotional dimension, often because of the emotional involvement we have with the subject, into something objective and which can be shared and used systematically in design processes. A second round of questions, but to the other participants, do not hesitate to ask questions, to prepare questions, or to put them on the chat. And I see that, yeah, maybe we can start then with the first question from Aisha Gül, please.
Thank you, Alain. And thank you, everyone, for this incredibly inspiring work that you're doing. Really, I took so many notes, and I'm really energized. I feel energized by what you've been able to accomplish, coming together, being in solidarity. And I see in the chat that there is, at least between Glitch and Chain, there is there's close conversation and solidarity going on. And that's actually one question I want to ask Shanley. Do you feel that you are being supported by other organizations? For instance, have you come together with Glitch and Chain, or are there organizations in France? And this is a general question for all of you. How do you, the kinds of points you're making about how to deal with gender-based violence are pushing, I think, the boundaries of the more established forms of, let's say, engaging gender-based violence. So, I mean, from your focus on intersectionality, putting gender at the center and not women and girls, and all the other, and of course, addressing digital violence, which not all organizations are equipped to do. So how are your relations with other organizations, and are they listening to you? Are they learning from you? Are you learning from them? Are there platforms where you come together to empower one another? So I'm really curious about that.
Well, so yeah, can you hear me? Great. Okay, so on the French scale, to begin with, we did not really get much support. It was like maybe 1-2 NGO, because they were, I think they were basically thinking that, you know, it's the cyberspace. You cannot do anything about it. It's an ongoing problem that has been going on for decades, and yeah, you cannot do anything about it. That was basically what we would hear. But then, yeah, we continued. We did not let go. We did not close our eyes on what was going on, and we have built some kind of legitimacy. And we've built recognition, and we have actually showed the fact that, yes, we can do something about it. And that's when we started working with more French NGOs, and when they actually considered us and understood. I think it's a matter of understanding. And so today we've got a strong support on the French scale. And then on the more international scale, well, we've been talking a little bit to Shane, so the Belgium, oh my gosh, sorry, I have French in my head, so sorry. On the Belgium side of it, and we also have been working with German NGOs, for example, Hate AIDS, which also fights against cyber violence, or Ananat, which is another collective, but specifically on image-based sexual abuse. We've been working with Não Partilhes, which is a Portuguese NGO against image-based sexual abuse as well. And yeah, I think that's so. I feel like we're not many NGOs against gender-based cyber violence, and more specifically on image-based sexual abuse. So, but maybe we don't know them. I don't know. But yeah.
Thank you. The reactions from Gabriela or Hera?
Yeah, I guess so. We work a lot with other civil society groups, particularly in the UK, and we have for a while. And I think that the fact that we've had the online safety bill to kind of coalesce around has really helped us meet each other and understand that we need to talk to each other and we need to do joint letters, joint actions to be able to get the government to move in the direction we want to see. So I think that's created a sense of urgency and a sense of community in the civil society groups in the UK. But one of the reasons I was really excited to kind of join today and what my role is kind of about is also about starting to open up Glitch's capacity, because we're a small organization, to be able to collaborate with other civil society organizations across Europe. So yeah, we are very much open to that, and we see that as crucial, particularly as we're doing this work on the EU AI Act and the Gender Directive. So we started to like meet lots and lots of new people, and you know, anyone on this call, I've put my email in the chat if you'd like to meet and connect and talk about our work and how it might cross over, then I'm totally open to that. I think, yeah, as you say, it's completely fundamental to the work that we do, and it's difficult because we're usually quite small organizations with not that much resource trying to do a huge amount of work. And it's frustrating because we're up against huge tech companies who have a lot of resource, and yet we're the ones that have to spend our time finding, you know, ways to collaborate and make sure that we are strong enough to be able to kind of speak on these issues. But it's fundamental. So making the time for it and ensuring that we're not duplicating work and that we're building on each other's work is absolutely crucial. Yeah.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I would propose to move to another subject which was opened up in a way by Shanley on the handling of Telegram, which brings me to the accountability recommendation we have in Resistere fact sheet on the tech companies and making them accountable. And you have tech companies and tech companies, so there are different types of companies and reactions. And maybe hear from you, Gabriela and Hera, how, on the basis of your experiences with tech companies, how you react to this question and this issue raised by Shanley on this difference. For instance, do they help you or not? Because they could also help you financially, but I let you react.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it's like definitely, you know, like you said, Alon, there's different types of tech companies. So in terms of the main focus of a lot of the sort of policymakers and nonprofits is on the big like social media companies, especially Meta, because it owns Instagram, WhatsApp. So I think there some companies are more open to talking than others. So there's all of them are in conversation with civil society though. I think that's it's just they have their own mechanisms of doing it. They're not very transparent about it, but they're kind of all have their networks, and there are then some established like forums where everybody gets together as well. In terms of Telegram, I mean, I'm a big fan of Telegram, and also understand all the risks that it comes with, because the fact it's so easy. Telegram, we've used Telegram actually for one of our services, and found it was a lot more effective than WhatsApp as a service provider. But that's the same kind of like, the reason why it makes it good is also the reason why it makes it bad, because it's so easy to open up so many channels on it. And I think Telegram is missing a beat for sure, because there are ways that they can make their product safer, which like Signal does, which Telegram doesn't do, and it can. And Telegram encryption, for example, is like optional. Signal, it's automatically enabled. There's like loads of things, and also things around reporting. It's very hard to report an account or a place in Telegram, and Telegram often says that it's shutting down these like groups that are mostly run by men around human trafficking or like image distribution. But then like new ones pop up because it's so easy, and they say they're doing it, but they don't. So I think with companies like Telegram, it's super important for them to invest proper money and resources into this, and not see that as like an add-on, and open a dialogue. I've never come across anyone from Telegram at any of these like tech civil society meetings, which I've always been surprised by because I use Telegram a lot and I really like it. So I'm personally, as an activist, as a user, invested in them being better, you know. But they don't. So I think that is a problem. Signal, on the other hand, actually has a very long-standing relationship with activists because it started for a very particular group. So because of the fact that it started to support activists who were trying to, you know, and journalists who were trying to hide their communication from authoritarian governments, like their whole design, everything is kind of gone. Again, I think Signal has a really good opportunity to do more work with civil society, and I don't know if they're doing it or not, but I think it's a tough one because we do want to have that balance between privacy but also in like very proactive monitoring, and it's just there's no clear answers here. I think it's like we just need to figure out about like how each platform, the kind of community that attracts, and what they can do to sort of tackle the abuse.
Thank you. Gabriela?
Yeah, I agree. I think the question about Telegram brings up the really tricky issues around encryption, and we've seen that a lot in the UK debate around a lot of organisations advocating for children's rights and working against child sexual exploitation and abuse, wanting to see an online safety bill as it is, that encryption can be broken to be able to scan this, and then the kind of privacy activists who are really concerned about you know, user and activist safety and being able to protect some sort of form of encryption always online. They're kind of up against each other, so it is complex, and they both sides understand the complexity of it, but there's no simple answer there. I think on your point around tech companies generally, yes, there's many different types of tech companies and every single one is different. There is a lot of focus on Meta, as Hera said, because they make up such a large part of the internet, particularly in certain geographies. You know, they represent in some ways the whole internet for certain communities because of the fact that they own Instagram, WhatsApp, Messenger, Facebook. And so there is a lot of focus on those companies. They do engage, but they engage on their terms. Meta's just set up an oversight board, but we're yet to see if they're going to, what kind of role the oversight board is going to play. It's independent, and it should, in theory, hold them more to account, but we will see how that develops. But, you know, there are lots of different types of companies. We see smaller dating platforms like Bumble who really want to set themselves apart from others and do a lot of campaigning on gender-based abuse and a lot of policy advocacy work as well. And then we see, you know, pornography platforms just absolutely not in the conversation at all, even though they, you know, have a huge number of users, and we need to have better conversations about how to keep sex workers safe on their platforms and users. So yeah, there's a lot out there, and there's a lot of different ways that you can work with tech companies, but
Thank you to open up this space, which goes further than what we have identified or understood as in the context of Resistere. So from the Resistere point of view, thank you. And maybe Agnieszka, if you allow me for the last minutes, if we can ask for your recommendations on our recommendations. So you said positive things, but maybe you have also messages to us that of issues which you consider essential and were not covered in our 6 recommendations. So if that would be the case, of course, if not, the better, but if it is, it would be interesting to hear it. Don't know if any of you or people in the audience, but I'm addressing first the 3 speakers. If you see gaps in or focus that we miss. Nobody volunteers? Yes,
I can just say a quick point on the education piece. As you heard from my presentation, that's incredibly important to our work and something we really want to work with others on as well. There is sometimes a focus, and you spoke about education for young people. There's a focus a lot on education via school and education for young people specifically, but we've never been taught as adults how to stay safe
we also have a gap. Oh, I've been told my internet is unelse.
Thank you. I think I got a point. I have to admit, I don't know if it's my connection or yours, but I had difficulty in understanding, but I think I got a point. Other reactions from Yara or Shanley?
I mean, I already went through mine in the beginning where I said that I think the balancing of privacy would be another one to add to it. Like Gabriella said, the really important thing about visioning the kind of internet we want, the kind of like platforms we want. And that comes from like doing that, you know, like better education from the very early on, in setting and changing those norms that it's not okay to, you know, behave in a way online that most people would feel the threat of consequences of doing in person. So I think that there's definitely that piece I think would be really good.
And thank you. Shanley?
Yeah, on my side, I have to admit all the recommendations are very interesting, and I've actually learned heaps of stuff, so it's actually really interesting. I don't know if it actually has the place in this, but I was thinking about algorithms, social media algorithms, to make them, how can I say this, transparent. But then is that another topic? I don't know. To what extent is this linked to this whole project and this whole research? Because yeah, algorithms and moderation, can we ask for transparency? I don't know. That was maybe something I was thinking about. I don't know what you think of this.
Thank you. I see nodding and reactions in the chat. Yeah, Agnieszka?
Yes, I will maybe take over right now, because even though the conversation is being incredibly interesting, and I think we could continue actually for hours, we are going to have to head towards the end of this webinar. So if you don't mind, I will do the wrap up right now. So first of all, I would like to thank all of you, I mean, especially our invited speakers, for your presence and for sharing your experiences today. I find it really incredible that despite this incredibly difficult and tough topic, there are so many passionate and enthusiastic people working on it. And I've noticed that both during today's discussion, but even before, when I was reaching out to various NGOs and stakeholders, everyone is really willing to share their knowledge and to make connections. And this is something that I would like to really highlight, because it is very important also for us within the Resistire project to create this sort of network of civil society and to support each other and advocate together for the same goals. And therefore, I would like to invite all of you to keep in touch, not only with each other, but also with us. We would love to hear from you. If there is anything you would like to add to our recommendations or suggest for the future research we will be carrying within the next and final cycle of the research project. So feel free to reach out. We are more than happy to listen to your feedback. And once again, thank you very much for our panelists and all the attendees of this webinar.